Hello and welcome to the next in the series of economics podcasts for A-Level Economics. This week I'm going to be talking about the macroeconomic policy conflicts that can occur. Firstly, a quick recap of what the main macro objectives are. The big four are full employment, inflation to be steady, around 2%, we don't want to risk going into deflation, the balance of payments to be in equilibrium, and economic growth to be high and sustainable. We recently learned three other things that the government's looked to do, which is for inequality not to be too high, to keep externalities low, and to have a balanced government budget, so not have a budget deficit. Quick note on full employment. Full employment, you're always going to have some unemployment, so we're never going to have 0% unemployment because we're always going to have some voluntary unemployment, and a bit of friction unemployment. Looking between jobs isn't actually a bad thing, means people are moving around, your economy's quite fluent. The first big macro policy conflict I'm going to talk about is full employment against inflation. If we've got full employment, if we're on our PPF, if our economy is growing and people are doing well, we've got full employment, that's going to mean people have a higher disposable income. Higher disposable income is going to mean there's going to be greater consumption, multiplier effects, which is going to lead to aggregate demand going up. Aggregate demand going right is going to cause us demand pull inflation. In a few weeks we'll view this on something called the Phillips curve that shows the trade-off between these two things. So at the moment, the UK's unemployment rate is very low, at 4.3%. A big however here, though, if you think of the Keynesian curve, and if we're on the flat bit with spare capacity, we need to look at the type of job. In our case, you've got lots of part-time jobs, 0-hour contracts. So there probably is still some spare capacity in the economy. Our current inflation rate being at 2.9%. The Bank of England were talking last week, the Monetary Policy Committee, of raising the interest rate to try and get that inflation back down to its 2% target. But most of this inflation is currently being caused by cost push factors, by imports being more expensive, which, if you think of the diagram, is your SRAS curve shifting to the left. So if the Bank of England did raise interest rates, which is one way of obviously trying to get your inflation down, the big negative of that is obviously that would move your aggregate demand to the left, output would go down, the economy would suffer. So if the Bank of England do raise interest rates, they've got that to think about. And in the UK, we're very sensitive to interest rate rises due to mortgages and the high level of debt in the country. The second policy conflict I want to talk about is economic growth and the balance of trade. If our economy is growing similarly to full employment, if people are in work and people are spending money, higher disposable income, in the UK we have a very high marginal propensity to import, meaning that when our incomes go up and when people have more money, we import lots of goods. So if our economy is doing well, then that would probably mean our trade deficit would worsen. Potential solutions to this, supply side policies. If we have supply side policies that move your LRAS curve to the right, this will improve our competitiveness, meaning we'll be able to produce more at a lower cost. Competitiveness is a good word to use in essays, especially when discussing trade. So if your LRS has gone to the right, prices have gone down, this makes our goods and services look cheaper to foreign buyers, and they're more likely to buy them, improving the trade balance. It's also very important in your essays to use current government policies. So as I keep saying, if you're talking about supply side policies, using education and training isn't incorrect. However, the government per head has cut education funding recently. University fees have obviously gone up again to £9,250 a year. So whilst education and training is a correct policy, it is not necessarily the most appropriate one to use because the government aren't currently doing it. Things they are doing, they're focusing on incentives for companies, for workers, and for investment. So obviously in terms of monetary policy, the Bank of England, we've had our interest rate being at 0.25% for a very long time. The aim is that this encourages businesses to invest in more machinery. LRAS goes to the right, we're more competitive. corporation tax is also been steadily lowered to 19% now. It's one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the G7, the biggest economies. Again, this is so that businesses get to keep their profits. If you get to keep more of your profits, you are more likely to invest. LRAS going to the right again. The income tax allowance has been raised. We're now at nearly £12,000. I think it's currently 11,600, the threshold. So people get the first nearly £12,000 now untaxed. This gives people an incentive to go to work. LRAS goes to the right. So they're currently things that the government is trying to do. A third policy conflict is economic growth or full employment against the environment or negative externalities. If an economy is working on its PPF, if an economy is growing, that quite often means you're going to have negative externalities. If you think China, factories, and all the other negative externalities that come with it, congestion maybe and things like that. In essays, you can discuss this in terms of some micro-analysis. So ways of solving that obviously are regulation against these negative externalities, taxing, pollution permits, all things that internalise the externality, that make the polluting firm pay for them so they're less likely to do them. In terms of examples, the Paris Agreement recently that America have pulled out of, that was an attempt to try and get people to agree solutions and ways of getting negative externalities down. Next one is economic growth or full employment against inequality. If your economy is growing, it quite often means that is accompanied by greater inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient and shown on a diagram in your Lorenz curve. Ronald Reagan in the 80s in America used the phrase trickle-down economics or trickle-down effects. Another good phrase to use in essays. If people at the top are getting richer, getting more money, Reagan believed that this would trickle down to people at the bottom in terms of jobs and greater spending. The Easterlin paradox says that once we get to a certain level of income, economic growth going any higher doesn't actually lead to us being any happier, in contrast to that. The marginal propensity to consume of people differs depending on how much income they have. The marginal propensity to consume for poorer people is much higher than it is for richer people. So as an example, if you give a homeless person £1, they will have a marginal propensity to consume that additional income of probably 100%. They will spend all of it. If you give a millionaire £1, they might save it, invest some and put it away. So the actual money going back into the economy causing more multiplier effects has a bigger impact the lower down you go. In terms of solutions to the problems of conflicts, quite often the essays will ask for what the policy conflicts are and explain them, but then they will also want solutions. So I've already touched upon ways of perhaps lowering inflation if that's one of the policy conflicts. You can lower inflation with contractionary, monetary or fiscal policy. So governments can raise taxes and cut spending, which would lower AD. And with monetary policy, we could increase the interest rate so people aren't spending as much, have less disposable income through paying back mortgages and debts and loans and things. The obvious disadvantage for this, and you would see this instantly if you drew it on a diagram, is that if AD goes to the left, obviously we have solved the inflation problem, but then we've gained the other problem of output being lower. So the sort of king of policies here, or sets, are your supply side policies. Things that move long run aggregate supply to the right. This would put prices down and output up. So your supply side policies are things that monetarists in particular are very much in favour of. Not to say Keynesians aren't, but Keynesians believe in that flat bit of LRAS. So Keynesians believe that we can have spare capacity at points, and then if the government spend money or lower taxes, you can boost aggregate demand without getting inflation. If you're a monetarist, you will believe that we are always in equilibrium. Therefore, any increase in AD will lead to demand pull inflation unless we have the corresponding increase in LRAS, so unless we've got our supply side policies. As I mentioned again earlier, currently in the UK, they're mainly looking at incentive-based policies. So in terms of income tax, the threshold has gone up. In terms of corporation tax for companies, the level has gone down. This is in the hope that it gives the incentive for businesses to invest. It gives the incentives for people to go to work. There's also been the freezing, which in real terms, when we've taken inflation into account, means the lowering of things like job seekers allowance. This, again, is to give people the incentive to go to work so we don't fall into this unemployment trap where being unemployed and on benefits is more valuable than being in work. There's also big infrastructure projects that you could use as examples. So better infrastructure improves mobility of labour, especially geographical mobility of labour, making it easier to move around the country and get to jobs, making things more efficient. So things like HS2 is a good example there. And I mentioned education and training earlier. If you are discussing education and training, you need to discuss it in a current government context. So this government has pushed and put quite a lot of money into apprenticeships, gets people into work, gets people into the right jobs, but not necessarily education and training in schools, as mentioned earlier. That is all today on the macroeconomic policy conflicts.